Ladies and gentlemen, true care isn't about self sacrifice, it's about setting healthy boundaries to sustain meaningful relationships. This is a concept that often feels counterintuitive, especially in a society that equates love and care with unending sacrifice. We are taught, consciously or unconsciously, that the more we give of ourselves, the more we prove our devotion. The result, many people find themselves pouring from an empty cup, emotionally drained and physically exhausted, all in the name of love, care, and commitment. But this approach is neither sustainable nor healthy. When we stretch ourselves too thin, we lose the ability to provide genuine care. We confuse overgiving with being a good friend, parent, partner, or colleague, and in doing so, we neglect the foundation that makes these relationships thrive, our own well being. Caring deeply for others doesn't mean abandoning yourself. It doesn't mean saying yes to every request, taking on every burden, or solving every problem that comes your way. Healthy boundaries are not barriers, they are bridges. They are the structures that allow love and care to flow in both directions without anyone feeling depleted or overwhelmed. Boundaries often get a bad reputation. People associate them with selfishness, coldness, or even rejection. But boundaries, when set with intention and clarity, are acts of compassion. They create a space where relationships can be nurtured rather than strained. They help us communicate what we can give without resentment and allow us to receive care from others without guilt. When boundaries are absent, relationships become lopsided. One person may feel overburdened while the other feels overly dependent. In the long run, this imbalance erodes trust, respect, and mutual support. Consider the metaphor of a garden. If you plant too many flowers in a small plot, none of them will thrive. They'll compete for sunlight, water, nutrients, and you'll find yourself constantly trying to keep them alive. But if you plan carefully, creating space for each flower to grow, your garden will flourish. Boundaries work the same way. They give relationships the space they need to grow and thrive without suffocating under the weight of overcare. Setting boundaries, however, is not always easy. It requires us to confront our own discomfort, fear of rejection, and the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be a caring person. For example, many of us grew up believing that saying no this is unkind or that prioritizing our needs is selfish. Unlearning these beliefs is a process, but it is a necessary one if we are to care for others without losing ourselves in the process. When you set a boundary, you're not saying, I don't care about you. You're saying, I care about you enough to ensure our relationship remains healthy and sustainable. This distinction is crucial. Without boundaries, care becomes performative rather than authentic. We begin to act out of obligation rather than love, which ultimately diminishes the quality of our care and the strength of our relationships. Boundaries also protect our energy. Imagine being a battery with a finite amount of charge each day. Every act of care you provide to others uses up some of that charge. If you don't take the time to recharge through rest, self care, or setting limits, you'll eventually run out of energy. When that happens, you're not just unable to care for others, you're unable to care for yourself. By setting boundaries, you're ensuring that your battery doesn't drain completely. You're creating a system that allows you to recharge so you can continue to give your best self to those you love. It's also important to remember that boundaries are not static, they evolve as relationships change and as you grow. What worked for you in the past may no longer serve you in the present, and that's okay. The key is to remain mindful and attuned to your own needs and the dynamics of your relationships. Regularly checking in with yourself and those around you can help ensure that your boundaries remain effective and compassionate. In practice, setting boundaries can look like many different things. It might mean declining an invitation when you're too tired to attend. It could involve delegating tasks at work or asking for help at home. It might even mean having difficult conversations with loved ones about what you can and cannot offer. These actions may feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you're not used to prioritizing your needs. But with time and practice, they become second nature, and the benefits stronger, healthier relationships are well worth the effort. Boundaries also teach others how to treat us. When we consistently prioritize others at the expense of ourselves, we unintentionally communicate that our needs don't matter. This can lead to a cycle where people come to expect more from us than we are able to give. But when we set boundaries, we model self respect and encourage others to do the same. In this way, boundaries not only improve our relationships but also inspire those around us to embrace their own limits and priorities. Emotional exhaustion is often an invisible weight we carry, one that builds slowly over time until it becomes almost unbearable. It doesn't arrive suddenly or dramatically, it creeps in quietly, disguised as irritability, detachment, or a persistent sense of overwhelm. Most of us don't even realize we're emotionally exhausted until it's too late because we've been conditioned to push through, to keep showing up, to keep caring, even when our emotional reserves are bone dry. The truth is, emotional exhaustion doesn't just affect how we feel internally, it impacts how we connect with others, how we show up in our relationships, and how we interpret the world around us. When we are emotionally drained, even the smallest requests can feel monumental. And even the people we love the most can start to feel like burdens rather than sources of joy. We often think of emotional exhaustion as something that happens after a major crisis or significant loss, but more often than not, it's the result of accumulated microstressors, small moments of overextension, little instances where we ignored our own limits day after day. It's the late night phone calls you felt obligated to answer, the endless emotional labor you perform to keep someone else afloat, the constant monitoring of others' moods to prevent conflict, and the times you said yes when every fiber of your being was screaming no. These little moments build up over time, and before you know it, you're running on fumes, you're pouring from an empty cup, and the people around you are starting to notice not because you've stopped caring, but because you no longer have anything left to give. Emotional exhaustion also brings with it a certain numbness. It's not always about feeling overwhelmed by too many emotions, sometimes it's about feeling nothing at all. You might find yourself zoning out during conversations, struggling to muster the energy to respond to a friend's text, or feeling disconnected from moments that should bring joy. This numbness isn't a lack of care, it's your brain and body's way of protecting you from further depletion. But the people around you may not see it that way. They might interpret your silence or distance as disinterest, and suddenly the exhaustion you've been carrying turns into guilt. You feel bad for not being fully present, for not showing up in the way you used to, and that guilt becomes yet another layer of emotional weight you carry. There's also an unspoken expectation, especially in close relationships, that if you care about someone, you will always have the emotional capacity to show up for them. But care is not an infinite resource. Emotional energy is like water in a well, it needs time to refill. Yet many of us operate under the illusion that if we just push a little harder, stretch ourselves a little thinner, we'll somehow find more to give. We forget that emotional capacity is finite, and we ignore the warning signs our minds and bodies give us. Headaches, fatigue, irritability, a lack of interest in things we once loved, these aren't just random symptoms, they are signals. They are our inner systems trying to get our attention, trying to tell us that we've gone too far for too long. One of the most insidious aspects of emotional exhaustion is that it can start to reshape how we see the people we care about. When you're running on empty, even the kindest requests can feel like demands, and even the most loving gestures can feel like pressure. You might start to feel resentment creeping in, not because you don't care, but because your emotional tank is empty, and every interaction feels like one more thing you have to navigate. It's not a reflection of your love or your commitment, it's a reflection of your exhaustion. But the people on the receiving end might not see it that way. They might sense the frustration in your voice, the distant look in your eyes, or the way you sigh before answering a question, and they might take it personally. At its core, emotional exhaustion is a breakdown of balance. It happens when the scales tip too far in one direction for too long, when the demands on your emotional energy consistently outweigh your ability to replenish it. And because caring for others often feels like a moral responsibility, it can be incredibly hard to admit when we've reached our limit. We might feel shame for needing rest, or fear that stepping back will mean we failed as a friend, parent, partner, or colleague. But emotional exhaustion doesn't mean you're weak or incapable. It means you're human. It means you've been carrying more than your share for longer than you should have. And your body and mind are asking no, begging you to pause. The irony is that the more emotionally exhausted we become, the less capable we are of providing the care and support we so desperately want to give. When we're depleted, we're not our best selves. We're not as patient, not as empathetic, not as attentive. And that doesn't just affect us, it affects everyone around us. The conversations we have, the way we listen, the energy we bring into a room, it all changes when we're running on empty. Emotional exhaustion doesn't just build walls between us and others it builds walls within us. It creates distance, not because we don't care, but because we don't have the capacity to bridge the gap anymore. Recognizing emotional exhaustion requires honesty with ourselves, a willingness to look inward and admit that something needs to change. It requires courage to pause, to say no, to step back, even when every societal message tells us to keep going. And perhaps most importantly, it requires self compassion. Because the truth is, you cannot care deeply for others if you are not also caring for yourself. And care, real, sustainable, impactful care, cannot grow in the soil of exhaustion. It needs space, rest, and renewal to thrive. The illusion of control is one of the most deeply ingrained patterns in our emotional and relational lives. It's subtle, insidious, and often masquerades as care, love, and responsibility. We tell ourselves that if we just try a little harder, say the right thing, anticipate every need, and smooth over every conflict, we can prevent bad outcomes. We can keep people happy, we can keep relationships intact, and we can keep everything running smoothly. But the truth is, control is just that, an illusion. And the more we cling to it, the more it controls us. It doesn't make our relationships stronger or our care more effective. Instead, it creates resentment, burnout, and distance between us and the people we're trying so hard to protect. At the heart of this illusion is fear, the fear of loss, the fear of failure, the fear of being seen as inadequate. We care so deeply about the people in our lives that the idea of them suffering, struggling, or even being disappointed feels unbearable. So we step in, we try to manage their emotions, fix their problems, and anticipate their needs before they even articulate them. On the surface, it looks like care, it looks like love in action. But underneath, it's often driven by our own discomfort with uncertainty. Because if we can control the outcome, if we can ensure that everything turns out okay, then we don't have to sit with the unbearable vulnerability of not knowing what might happen next. The problem is, control doesn't actually prevent outcomes, it just exhausts us. It keeps us on high alert, constantly scanning for threats and problems, constantly monitoring other people's behavior, and constantly managing not only our own emotional state, but also everyone else's. It's a heavy burden to carry, and it's one that eventually wears us down. Because no matter how hard we try, no matter how much we care, we cannot control other people's feelings, choices, or actions. We cannot guarantee their happiness, and we cannot shield them from pain. And when we inevitably fail to do the impossible, we don't just feel disappointed, we feel like we failed. Like we weren't good enough, smart enough, or loving enough to make everything okay. This pattern shows up in so many ways in our lives. Maybe it's the parent who hovers over their child, trying to prevent every misstep or mistake because they're terrified of watching them struggle. Maybe it's the friend who always steps in to mediate conflicts, trying to keep the peace even at the cost of their own emotional well being. Or maybe it's the partner who feels responsible for their significant other's happiness, bending over backward to avoid any hint of dissatisfaction or discomfort. In every case, the underlying motivation is the same. If I can control the situation, if I can control this person's emotions, then I can feel safe. Then I can feel like I've done enough. But here's the hard truth: other people's emotions are not our responsibility. Their happiness, their sadness, their choices, they belong to them, not to us. And when we try to take ownership of something that isn't ours, we not only exhaust ourselves, but we also rob them of their agency. We send the message, intentionally or unintentionally, that we don't trust them to handle their own lives, that we don't believe they are capable of navigating their own emotions, solving their own problems, or learning from their own mistakes. And that kind of dynamic doesn't foster connection, it creates dependency, resentment, and over time, a deep sense of disconnection. Letting go of the illusion of control doesn't mean we stop caring. It doesn't mean we stop showing up, loving deeply, or offering support. It means we do those things without the expectation that we can or should dictate the outcome. It means we recognize where our responsibility ends and someone else's begins. It means we learn to sit with discomfort, with uncertainty, and with the knowledge that we cannot prevent every hard thing from happening to the people we love. And that's hard. It's so hard because it requires us to face our own vulnerability. It requires us to acknowledge that we are not omnipotent, that our love cannot always shield others from pain, and that sometimes the most caring thing we can do is step back and let people face their own challenges. But letting go of control is also freeing. It allows us to show up with more authenticity, more honesty, and more compassion. Instead of micromanaging every detail of someone else's life, we can simply be present with them. We can listen without trying to fix, we can offer support without trying to steer, and we can love without trying to control. And when we do that, something beautiful happens. Our relationships become more honest, more equal, and more fulfilling. We stop performing care and we start embodying it. Of course, letting go of control doesn't happen overnight. It's not a one time decision, it's an ongoing practice. It's a series of small choices made day after day to step back, to breathe, and to trust ourselves, trust the people we love, and trust that even if things don't go exactly as we hoped, we will still be okay. It's about learning to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, of not being able to fix, and of not being able to guarantee an outcome. And that's not easy. Vulnerability never is. But it's worth it because real connection cannot grow in the shadow of control. It requires space, trust, and the willingness to let go of the reins, even when every instinct tells us to hold on tighter. When we finally release our grip, when we stop trying to manage and fix everything, we give ourselves permission to simply care, to show up, to love, and to support without carrying the impossible weight of control. And in doing so, we not only liberate ourselves, but we also allow the people we care about to grow, to learn, and to become who they are meant to be. And that kind of care, the kind that comes without strings, without conditions, and without control, is the most powerful care of all. Self worth and people pleasing are tangled together in a web that many of us don't even realize we're caught in until we're completely stuck. At its core, people pleasing isn't just about wanting to make others happy, it's about believing that our worth is tied to how useful, agreeable, or accommodating we are to those around us. It's about feeling like love, acceptance, and belonging must be earned through service, sacrifice, and relentless availability. And for many of us, this belief is so deeply embedded that we can't see it. It feels natural, even virtuous. We tell ourselves that being endlessly giving, endlessly available, and endlessly accommodating is what makes us good people. But underneath that surface level goodness, there's a constant hum of anxiety, a fear that if we stop, if we say no, if we disappoint someone, if we fail to meet an expectation, our worthiness will be called into question. The truth is, people pleasing is rarely about genuine care, it's about survival. At some point in our lives, maybe in childhood, maybe in our earliest relationships, we learned that keeping others happy kept us safe, safe from rejection, safe from criticism, safe from conflict. And so we became experts at reading people's moods, anticipating their needs, and smoothing over any potential tension. Over time, this behavior became a pattern, and that pattern became an identity. We became the reliable one, the peacemaker, the fixer. These labels felt good because they came with validation and praise. They made us feel needed, valuable, and most importantly, worthy of love. But the cost of tying our self worth to our usefulness is steep. Because every yes we give when we mean no, every boundary we abandon, and every moment we prioritize someone else's comfort over our own truth chips away at our sense of self. The exhaustion that comes from people pleasing isn't just physical, it's emotional and spiritual. It's the exhaustion of living outside of your integrity, of saying one thing and feeling another, of showing up in ways that betray your own needs. It's smiling when you're hurt, agreeing when you're resentful, and pretending to be okay when you're anything but. And the most painful part is that no matter how much you give, it's never enough. The validation that comes from people pleasing is fleeting. It feels good in the moment when someone says, "Thank you, I don't know what I'd do without you," or "You're such a good friend," but it fades quickly. And then you're left chasing the next moment of approval, the next opportunity to prove your worth through service, the next chance to feel seen and valued. What makes this cycle even harder to break is that it's often reinforced by the people around us. When you spend years or even decades being the person who always says yes, always steps in, and always puts others first, people come to expect it. And when you start to shift, when you set boundaries, when you say no, when you prioritize your own needs, it disrupts the balance. People might push back, they might question you, they might even get angry. And that reaction can feel unbearable because it pokes at your deepest fear that without your endless giving, you are unlovable. But here's the thing, when people react negatively to your boundaries, it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means the dynamic is shifting, and change, even when it's healthy, is uncomfortable. Learning to separate your self-worth from people-pleasing is not easy work. It requires a level of self-awareness and vulnerability that can feel raw and uncomfortable. It means sitting with the discomfort of someone else's disappointment without rushing in to fix it. It means letting go of the belief that your value lies in how much you do for others. And perhaps most importantly, it means learning to validate yourself, to recognize your own worth without needing someone else to affirm it. This is not about becoming selfish or uncaring. It's about understanding that true care, deep, meaningful, sustainable care cannot come from a place of depletion or resentment. It cannot come from a place where your giving is tied to your worthiness. The irony of people pleasing is that it often creates the very outcomes we're trying to avoid. When we're constantly overextending ourselves, we become resentful, bitter, and exhausted. And those feelings seep into our relationships, whether we intend them to or not. The smile becomes tight, the voice becomes sharp, and the energy we bring into the room feels heavy. People can sense it, even if they don't know exactly what's wrong. And suddenly the care we've worked so hard to provide feels tainted by frustration. The connection we've been striving to protect starts to erode, not because we stopped caring, but because we cared in ways that drained us instead of filling us up. Stepping out of this pattern means learning a new way of being in relationships, a way that prioritizes honesty over appeasement, boundaries over burnout, and authenticity over approval. It means showing up as your whole self, not just the parts that are pleasing, agreeable, or easy to love. And yes, that's terrifying. Because when you stop performing care and start offering it from a place of wholeness, you risk being seen, truly seen. You risk someone not liking the version of you that has limits, that says no, that prioritizes rest. But you also create space for real connection. Connection that isn't built on performance or obligation, but on mutual respect and trust. The beautiful thing about breaking free from the cycle of people pleasing is that it doesn't just heal you, it heals your relationships. Because when you show up with your full, authentic self, you give others permission to do the same. You model what it looks like to care deeply without losing yourself in the process. And while not everyone will understand or appreciate this shift, the ones who truly value you will stay. They'll adjust, they'll respect your boundaries, and they'll love you not for what you can do for them, but simply for who you are. And that kind of love, that kind of connection is worth every moment of discomfort, every difficult conversation, and every step it takes to untangle your worth from the impossible task of keeping everyone else happy. When we talk about resentment, we often think of it as something sharp and immediate, a heated argument, a breaking point, a moment when everything spills over. But resentment doesn't usually start that way. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a slow drip from a leaky faucet. It builds over time, drop by drop, until one day you're standing in a flood, wondering how you got there. Resentment is one of those emotions we don't like to admit to ourselves, let alone to others, because it feels petty, unkind, or even shameful. But underneath resentment is often something deeper and more vulnerable, a sense of being unseen, unheard, or undervalued. It's not just anger, it's the echo of unmet needs and unspoken truths that we've buried because we didn't feel safe enough, brave enough, or worthy enough to bring them to the surface. Resentment often grows in spaces where we've overgiven without acknowledgement, where we've sacrificed without reciprocity, and where we've silenced ourselves to keep the peace. It thrives in relationships where our needs have consistently taken a backseat to someone else's comfort, where our boundaries have been ignored or dismissed, and where our emotional labor has been expected rather than appreciated. And here's the hard truth: most of the time, resentment doesn't stem from what someone else did to us, it stems from what we allowed to happen to ourselves. It comes from the times we said yes when we meant no, the times we swallowed our hurt to avoid confrontation, and the times we convinced ourselves that our needs were too much, too inconvenient, or too insignificant to matter. But let's be clear, recognizing our role in our own resentment isn't about blaming ourselves, it's about reclaiming our power. Because when we realize that resentment is often born from self abandonment, we also realize that healing it isn't about waiting for someone else to change, it's about changing how we show up for ourselves. It's about getting honest about the patterns we've been repeating, the boundaries we've been avoiding, and the expectations we've been silently carrying. And that honesty is hard. It requires us to look at the ways we've made ourselves small to make others comfortable, the ways we've overextended ourselves in hopes of earning love or validation, and the ways we've quietly kept score in relationships where we never felt like we could ask for what we needed. Resentment has a way of seeping into every corner of our lives if we let it. It doesn't stay confined to the situation or relationship where it was born, it spreads. It shows up in our tone of voice, in the way we withdraw, in the passive aggressive comments we can't quite keep inside. It clouds our ability to see people clearly because everything they do starts to feel like another reminder of how much we've given and how little we've received in return. And maybe the most heartbreaking part of resentment is that it doesn't just damage our relationships with others, it damages our relationship with ourselves. It chips away at our self trust because every time we silence ourselves or betray our own boundaries, we send a message to ourselves that our feelings, our needs, and our truth don't matter. One of the most challenging things about resentment is that it's often tied to unspoken expectations. We expect people to notice when we're tired, to appreciate the sacrifices we've made, to intuitively understand our needs without us having to say them out loud. And when they don't, we feel hurt, disappointed, and angry. But unspoken expectations are a dangerous game because they leave so much room for misunderstanding and unmet needs. People aren't mind readers, and as much as we wish they could just see us and know what we need, they can't unless we tell them. And yet, telling them feels so vulnerable. It feels risky to say, I need more support, or I feel unappreciated, or I'm exhausted and I can't keep showing up this way. But that vulnerability is where healing begins. It's where resentment starts to. There's a moment, a quiet, almost imperceptible moment when you realize you've been pouring from an empty cup for far too long. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as waking up one day and feeling a heaviness in your chest that you can't quite explain, or standing in front of the mirror and not recognizing the tired, worn out person staring back at you. It might come as a fleeting thought, I can't keep doing this. And then, almost immediately, the guilt follows. Because how can you even think about stopping? How can you pull back when people rely on you, need you, expect you to be the person who holds it all together? And so you keep going. You keep showing up, keep saying yes, keep stretching yourself thinner and thinner until there's almost nothing left. But here's the thing, the cost of abandoning yourself in service to others is far greater than any guilt you might feel for taking a step back. Burnout isn't just physical exhaustion, it's emotional, mental, and spiritual depletion. It's the point at which your body and mind begin to rebel against the demands you've placed on them. Maybe it looks like chronic fatigue, insomnia, or persistent headaches. Maybe it feels like numbness, apathy, or a sense of dread about even the smallest tasks. Or maybe it's something subtler, a growing disconnection from the people you love, a loss of joy in the things that used to light you up, or a creeping sense of resentment towards the very people you've been bending over backward to care for. Burnout doesn't happen overnight. It's the result of 1,000 tiny moments of self-abandonment, of ignoring the signals your body and mind have been sending you, of pushing past your limits again and again because you thought you had to. For so many of us, rest feels indulgent. Taking time for ourselves feels selfish. We've been conditioned to believe that productivity equals worth, that busyness is a badge of honor, and that slowing down is a sign of weakness or laziness. And when your value has been tied to your output, when your identity has been wrapped up in being the reliable one, the strong one, the one who's always there, it feels terrifying to let go of that role, even for a moment. But the truth is, you cannot pour from an empty cup. You cannot continue to show up for others in meaningful, authentic ways if you're running on fumes. At some point, something has to give. And more often than not, if you don't intentionally choose to slow down, your body or your mind will make the choice for you. The hardest part of stepping back, of prioritizing your own well being, is confronting the fear of what might happen when you do. Will people still love you if you're not constantly proving your worth through acts of service? Will they still rely on you if you set boundaries and say no? Will they still see you as valuable if you're not overextending yourself to meet their every need? These fears are deeply rooted in our need for belonging, in our fear of rejection, and in our longing to feel significant in the lives of others. But here's the truth, the people who genuinely care about you, the people who truly see you, will not love you less for taking care of yourself. In fact, they'll respect you more, they'll learn from you, and they'll understand that your worth was never tied to how much you could do for them in the first place. Learning to care for yourself isn't about grand gestures or perfect self-care routines. It's not about bubble baths and spa days, though those things can be wonderful. It's about the small, consistent choices you make every single day to honor your own needs. It's about saying no without guilt, about asking for help without shame, and about allowing yourself to rest without feeling like you have to earn it. It's about tuning into your own body, your own emotions, and your own energy levels and actually listening to what they're telling you. And yes, that's hard. It's hard because it requires you to confront all the ways you've been neglecting yourself. It requires you to admit that you are not an endless well of energy and patience and care, that you have limits, and those limits are not weaknesses, they're human. But caring for yourself isn't just about you, it's about the people you love too. Because when you show up as a depleted, resentful, exhausted version of yourself, the people around you feel it. They feel the tightness in your voice, the forced smile, the edge in your words. And whether you intend to or not, you start to build walls. You start to pull away, not because you don't care, but because you simply don't have anything left to give. But when you care for yourself, when you prioritize your own well being, you show up differently. You show up with more presence, more patience, and more genuine love. You show up as someone who isn't just performing care, but actually embodying it. And that kind of presence is a gift not just to you, but to everyone around you. The act of caring for yourself isn't a betrayal of the people who rely on you, it's an investment in them. Because when you're well rested, emotionally balanced, and in tune with your own needs, you're able to give from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. You're able to love without resentment, to listen without distraction, and to show up fully instead of halfway. But this shift requires a willingness to let go of the guilt, to unlearn the belief that your worth is tied to how much you can endure, and to recognize that you are just as deserving of care, love, and support as anyone else. The reality is, no one is coming to save you from burnout. No one is going to swoop in and give you permission to rest. That permission has to come from you. You have to decide that you are worthy of the same care and compassion that you so freely give to others. And you have to practice that decision every single day in the boundaries you set, in the way you talk to yourself, and in the choices you make about how you spend your time and energy. It's not easy. It's not quick. And it's not always comfortable, but it's necessary. Because the cost of continuing to abandon yourself in the name of being everything to everyone is far too high. And the only person who can change that pattern, the only person who can truly give you the care you deserve is you.